I'm Ray Hagins. The third Sunday in March 1991 is a day that I'll never forget. Sunday, March 17th, 1991. The reason why I'll never forget this day is because it was the turning point in my ministry. I stood up to preach that morning, and I was going to preach from Romans, the 8th chapter, the 28th verse, which says, "And we know that all things work together for the good, to them who are the called according to God's purpose." But just before reading the text that day, it was as though someone was standing right behind my right shoulder and whispered into my right ear these words: "Did people know God before Moses went up on the mountain?" Out of nowhere, that question just popped in my mind. Now I understand what it was really all about. It was God's time for me to come into an awareness of something that I had not been taught before. The question haunted me so strongly until the next day I was just doing some reading about Moses. That was a powerful question for me because all of my theology began with Moses coming down off the mountain, which meant if people had a God consciousness before Moses went up on the mountain, then what was that God consciousness, and what was the name of that God, and what was the religious belief system of those people? Well, in my reading and in my research, I came across something that's stated in the book of Acts, the 7th chapter, and it says plainly, in the 20th verse of the 7th chapter of Acts, it says, "In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, or put out of his home, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, and nourished him for her own son." Now notice the 22nd verse. It says, "And Moses was learned," or educated, "in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds." That statement, that passage, was life-changing for me. Ironically, or maybe I should say efficaciously, or by divine providence, a few days later, I was in downtown Patterson, New Jersey, and parked in front of an old bookstore called Bazaar Books. I had seen this bookstore many times before and had never been moved or unctioned in any way whatsoever to go in it. This day, I was moved to go into the store. And immediately I went to the religion and philosophy section of the books. And as I browsed through the books, I saw this book right here. It's called Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection. Isn't it something? Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection. I opened the cover to the forward of the book, and here's what it says. And let me read it for you. It says, "The central figure of the ancient Egyptian religion was Osiris, and the chief fundamentals of his cult were the belief in his divinity, death, resurrection, and absolute control of the destinies of the bodies and souls of men. The central point of each Osirian's religion was his hope of resurrection in a transformed body and of immortality, which could only be realized by him through the death and resurrection of Osiris." I don't know if you are noticing this, what happened to me that day. I don't know if you see it, but there was a big problem here because everything that I just read in this paragraph is what I had been teaching throughout the course of my ministry and raised on all my life. But instead of calling the person Osiris, I was taught to call him Jesus. Now this presented a further problem for me because approximately 3 years before this, I was invited to a fellowship of black men who were trying to develop plans for economic empowerment among Africans in America. Before I could even get into the meeting, I just overheard a conversation of one of the brothers talking about a man named Horace. And he said these words: Jesus' real name was Horace. Of course, being a pastor and being one who was committed to the defense of the gospel that I had been taught, I immediately interrupted this man and said, "What do you mean Jesus' real name was Horace?" And he said to me that the real, original Christ child, virgin-born child, his name was Horace. I thought he was saying Horace, H-O-R-A-C-E. But then when I heard him say that the ancient African Trinity was Osiris, Isis, and Horus, I jumped up in my defense of what I had been taught. And I said to this brother and the other black men that were there, I said, "Satan, the Lord rebuke you. The blood of Jesus is against you." And I actually talked about these men everywhere I went for almost 1 year. I felt it my duty to defend the truth that I thought I knew. I felt it my duty to protect those who were believers in the gospel that the white man gave us. I felt that I should protect them from this deception that these brothers, these black men, were talking. I misused my radio show. I misused my television show to blast these brothers as often as I could, warning people everywhere about these agents of Satan, so I thought. Well, when I read what you just saw, it threw a big monkey wrench into my machinery, or the machinery of my theology. I began to do research, brothers and sisters, and that's really what this tape is about. My research began to take me into a realm of discovering African evidence that everything that I had been taught, everything that I was preaching, everything that I was teaching was stolen, copied, plagiarized, and then represented back to us under a European ethnicity. I became so traumatized. I went through so much cognitive dissonance in what I was learning from my own research that I resigned from the ministry in 1993. The reason why I resigned is because I felt unqualified to teach. Of course, the temptation was there to just ignore what I had learned and keep teaching what I had been taught, because that's what everybody expected from me. But something inside me, I take that back, and now I know what it was. My ancestors inside me would not let me forsake the truth. So that's what this tape is all about, and I pray that as you watch this tape, that you will see what I have come to find to be undeniable evidence. You don't have to believe anything in this tape. You can do your own research. In fact, I hope you will. But this tape is entitled African Evidence That Demands an African Verdict. And I pray that as you watch this tape, that the ancestors and the Spirit of God will speak to your heart and let you know that it's time for Africans everywhere to return to our ancient African truths, which is really the African origins of Christianity, the African origins of Judaism, the African origins of Islam, the African origins of Western religious thought, the African origins of actually civilization. I pray that you be blessed by this tape. Hotep, which means peace.